He never threatened anyone. He never touched them. He just agreed when they told him when they would die. And somehow, they were always right. It was raining, but not in any dramatic way. Just enough to be annoying. Enough to make people walk faster and think less. James Carter stood outside the corner shop, checking his watch for the third time in a minute. Thursday. 9:12 p.m. He hated being late. Not because it mattered, but because it made him feel careless, and James Carter had spent his entire life avoiding that particular accusation. 2 minutes, he muttered. I have exactly 2 minutes. The shop door opened behind him. You're talking to yourself again, said his wife. Helen Carter was holding a small paper bag and smiling the kind of smile that meant she had already forgiven him for whatever he was about to apologize for. I wasn't talking, James said. I was negotiating. With who? With time. She raised an eyebrow. That sounds unhealthy. James shrugged and took the bag from her. Doctor says I should reduce stress, he said. So now I argue with abstract concepts instead of people. They started walking toward the car. The street was quiet. A few lights in the windows. The sea somewhere nearby, invisible but loud enough to remind everyone it was there. Helen glanced at him. You're quiet, she said. I'm always quiet. No, she said. You're calculating quiet. That's different. James smiled faintly. Work, he said. End of the fiscal year. Numbers misbehaving. Numbers don't misbehave, Helen said. People do. That's exactly what worries me. They reached the car. James unlocked it, then stopped. He looked at the sky, grey and flat, like an unconvincing excuse. You know, he said casually, I don't think I'll make it past Thursday night. Helen laughed. Very funny. I'm serious. She turned to him. James. No, listen, he said. It's not a bad thing. Just a thought. One of those thoughts you get when everything feels finished. She studied his face. You're tired, she said. You need sleep. Probably. You are coming home after the meeting, right? Of course. She hesitated. Then don't say things like that. Like what? Like you're already writing your own obituary. James opened the car door. If I were, he said, it would be very boring. He paid his taxes on time and never won an argument. Helen sighed. Get in, she said. Before you scare yourself. They drove off. James Carter died at 11:47 p.m. The official report would later describe it as a tragic accident. A slip. Wet pavement. Unfortunate timing. There was nothing unusual about the body. Nothing suspicious about the scene. Except for the fact that 3 people clearly remembered him saying the same sentence earlier that evening. I don't think I'll make it past Thursday night. Detective Inspector Mark Sullivan stood under a street lamp, staring at the pavement like it might confess something if he looked at it long enough. It's just one of those things, said the uniformed officer beside him. People say stupid stuff all the time. Sullivan grunted. They do, he said. They just don't usually get it right to the minute. The officer shrugged. Coincidence. Everything's a coincidence until it isn't, Sullivan replied. Write it down. Write what down? Exactly how he said it. The officer blinked. How he said it? Yes, Sullivan said. Words matter. Especially the last unnecessary ones. 2 days later, a woman named Laura Mitchell told her coworker she wouldn't live to see Sunday morning. She said it with a smile. She said it while pouring coffee. She said it like it was a joke that had already gone stale. On Sunday at 6:03 a.m., her car went off the road. By the time the third case landed on Mark Sullivan's desk, the local paper had already found a name for it. The man who knew the time of death. Sullivan read the headline, exhaled slowly, and reached for his phone. He dialed a number he hadn't used in months. The line clicked. "Yes," came a calm, tired voice. "Edward," Sullivan said. "I need you to tell me something. Only if I'm allowed to tell you, you won't like it." Sullivan looked at the file on his desk. "I think," he said carefully, "someone in my city is teaching people when to die." There was a pause. Then Edward Hale spoke. "Then," he said, "you're not dealing with death." "What am I dealing with?" Edward's voice remained even. "Certainty." Edward Hale disliked police stations for the same reason he disliked hospitals. Everyone inside pretended things were under control. The Brighton Central Station smelled of disinfectant, burnt coffee, and mild panic. Edward noticed all three immediately, and none of them interested him. Detective Inspector Mark Sullivan was waiting near the glass offices, arms crossed, expression permanently stuck between irritation and relief. "You look exactly the same," Sullivan said. "That's disappointing," Edward replied. "I was hoping for a dramatic decline." "You got thinner. Stress burns calories. Or conscience?" Edward smiled faintly. "Good to see you too, Mark." They shook hands. Sullivan's grip was firm, practical. A man who trusted objects more than people. "You read the files?" Sullivan asked as they started walking. "I skimmed them," Edward said. "The deaths are boring. The sentences are not." Sullivan glanced at him. "You always say that. And I'm always right." They entered a small interview room. One table, 4 chairs, a flickering light that no one had bothered to fix. Sullivan dropped 3 folders on the table. James Carter. Laura Mitchell. Peter Lawson, he said. No connection. Different ages, jobs, lifestyles. Edward opened the first folder. Different words, he said. What? They didn't use different words, Edward replied. They used the same one. Sullivan exhaled. Here we go. Edward looked up. You called me, Mark. If you wanted coincidence, you could have stayed home. Sullivan didn't argue. An hour later, Edward was standing in a modest living room that still smelled faintly of aftershave and furniture polish. Helen Carter sat opposite him, hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. I've already told the police everything, she said. I know, Edward replied calmly. I'm not here for everything. I'm here for one sentence. She frowned. Which one? Edward leaned back slightly. The unnecessary one. She thought for a moment. He said, she hesitated. He said he wouldn't make it past Thursday night. Edward nodded. Did he sound afraid? No. Dramatic? No. Did he pause before saying it? She shook her head slowly. No. It just came out. Edward made a note. Like a conclusion, he said. She looked at him sharply. Yes, she said. Exactly like that. Outside, Sullivan lit a cigarette, then remembered Edward hated smoke and put it out again. Happy? He asked. No, Edward said. Interested? That's worse. Edward ignored him. Who else heard him say it? His wife. The shop clerk. One neighbor. And all remember it clearly. Yes. Edward adjusted his coat. When people remember exact phrasing, he said, it means the phrasing mattered. They drove to the university cafe where Peter Lawson had spent his last afternoon. The place was quiet, polite, forgettable. A young woman behind the counter smiled nervously. You're asking about Mr. Lawson? Yes, Edward said. Did he say anything strange? She hesitated. He said he wouldn't be alive to see Monday. Edward tilted his head. Did you ask why? No, she said. He said it like weather. Sullivan frowned. Like weather. Like something already decided. Edward's eyes flicked to Sullivan. There it is again. Back in the car, Sullivan rubbed his temples. So what? Someone's predicting deaths now. No, Edward said. Someone's ending conversations. Sullivan looked at him. That's not a crime. Neither is convincing someone the door is locked, Edward said. Until they stop trying to open it. They sat in silence for a moment. You think someone told them? Sullivan asked. I think someone agreed with them, Edward replied. Agreed with what? With the idea that the end was near. Sullivan snorted. That's it? That's your theory. Edward looked out the window. Certainty is addictive, he said. Once you give it to someone, they'll do the rest. That evening, Edward met Claire Bennett at a small bar near the pier. She was already halfway through a drink and fully through her patience. You're late, she said. I wanted you annoyed, Edward replied. Makes people honest. She laughed. Still charming. You wrote the headline, he said. Why? Because people were already whispering, she replied. I just gave it punctuation. You gave it authority. And you give it denial, she shot back. Balance. Edward leaned closer. Do you believe someone knows the time of death? She studied him. No, she said. But I believe people want someone who does. Later that night, Edward sat alone in his flat, listening to the rain. He replayed voices in his head. Not facts. Not timelines. Voices. Same calm. Same certainty. Same acceptance. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Simon, he said when the line connected. I have a question. Dr. Simon Keller sighed. You always do. What happens when someone stops doubting the future? There was a pause. Then, Keller said slowly, they stop surviving it. Edward ended the call and stared at the dark window. For the first time since arriving in Brighton, he felt something close to unease. Not because people were dying, but because someone understood exactly how to make them stop living. Edward Hale woke up at 5:26 a.m. Not because of a sound. Not because of a dream. Because his mind had reached a conclusion. He lay still, staring at the ceiling, replaying voices like a badly edited radio broadcast. Same tone. Same calm. Same choice of words. People who were afraid didn't sound like that. People who were desperate didn't sound like that either. These people sounded decided. Edward got up, made coffee he would forget to drink, and opened his notebook. He didn't write names. He wrote sentences. By noon, Mark Sullivan was standing in Edward's kitchen, looking deeply uncomfortable. You could have come to the station, Sullivan said. I don't think clearly there, Edward replied. Too many people pretending. Sullivan ignored that. We have another one, he said. Edward didn't ask when. Who, he asked instead. Peter Lawson, Sullivan said. Died last night. Heart attack. Edward closed his notebook. And the sentence? Sullivan hesitated. He told his neighbor he wouldn't live to see the end of the week. Edward nodded once. Did he believe it? That's the problem, Sullivan said. He didn't believe in anything. Peter Lawson's house was clean in the way only lonely houses are. No photos on the walls. Books arranged by height, not subject. A kettle still half full. Edward walked slowly, listening to the space. He wasn't depressed, Sullivan said. Doctor confirmed it. No history. No medication. Edward stopped by the armchair. He sat here, Edward said. Sullivan blinked. How do you? The sentence, Edward said. He said it while sitting down. Sullivan stared at him. You're guessing. Yes, Edward said calmly. But I'm right. They stood in silence. Finally, Sullivan spoke. "So what are you saying?" Edward looked at the empty room. "I'm saying someone removed uncertainty from his life," he said. And that was enough. The neighbor was a retired engineer named Malcolm Price. Precise. Literal. Annoyed by nonsense. He said it like a statement, Malcolm said. Not like a fear. "Did you argue?" Edward asked. "No," Malcolm said. "Why would I?" "People say things." Edward leaned forward. "What exactly did you say in response?" Malcolm frowned. "I said, 'If you're sure.'" Edward nodded slowly. There it was again. Agreement. Outside, Sullivan swore under his breath. "That's it," he said. "That's the magic trick. Someone says something, people nod, and they die." Edward looked at him. "When enough people nod," he said, "certainty becomes contagious." That afternoon, Edward visited Laura Mitchell's sister. Emily Mitchell was angry in the way grief sometimes demands. She tried to change it, Emily said. She booked a train. Packed a bag. She said if she wasn't here, it wouldn't happen. Edward listened carefully. "And?" "She died on the motorway," Emily said. "At the exact time?" Edward asked quietly. "Did anyone tell her it wouldn't matter?" Emily froze. "Yes." Edward wrote it down. By evening, the city had started whispering. Edward heard it in cafes. On buses. In half-jokes and unfinished sentences. "If it's your time, they say he knows, someone told me." People weren't afraid. They were curious. Edward met Claire Bennett again, this time in her office. "You've turned a city into a countdown," he said. She didn't deny it. "People like numbers," she said. "Dates. Times. Endpoints. Do you know what happens when they believe them?" She shrugged. "They stop asking questions." Edward leaned closer. "And start waiting." That night, Edward finally heard the voice. Not directly. Not clearly. A recording. Sullivan had sent him a voicemail from a witness interview. Just background noise. A conversation caught accidentally. "I suppose if that's when it ends, yes," another voice replied calmly. "That sounds right." Edward replayed it 3 times. The second voice wasn't emotional. Wasn't dominant. It was certain. Edward felt a chill he did not like. Not fear. Recognition. He called Simon Keller. "This isn't mass hysteria," Edward said. "It's guided." "Someone reinforcing conclusions," Keller replied. "Carefully." "Like therapy," Edward said. "Yes," Keller answered. "Or interrogation." Edward closed his eyes. "I used to do this," he said. "I know," Keller replied gently. "That's what worries me." Later, alone again, Edward stood by his window. A man across the street laughed loudly, talking about weekend plans. Edward watched him carefully. Not because he thought the man would die, but because he wondered how easy it would be to make him stop believing he wouldn't. Edward whispered to the empty room. "This isn't about knowing the time of death." He paused. "It's about removing the future." Edward Hale disliked patterns. Not because they were hard to see. Because once you saw them, you had to admit someone built them. He spent the morning doing what police rarely had time to do, listening. Not to statements. Not to alibis. To how people told their stories. He played witness interviews back to back, not for content, but for cadence. Some people lied quickly. Some lied slowly. Some told the truth like it was a burden. But the voice in the background, the calm yes, "That sounds right," didn't belong in any of those categories. It belonged to someone who wasn't trying to persuade. Someone who believed persuasion was beneath him. Someone who treated a person's future like a small administrative detail. Edward closed his laptop and stared at the wall as if it might provide a confession. Then he stood up, picked up his coat, and went to find the place where certainty was sold. Sullivan met him outside Brighton Central with the expression of a man who regretted every life choice that had led him to collaborating with Edward Hale. "You look like you haven't slept," Sullivan said. "I slept," Edward replied. "I just didn't rest." "That's called not sleeping." Edward ignored him. "Show me the witness list again," he said. Sullivan handed him a page. "Names, times, locations." Edward scanned it. "Malcolm Price," Edward murmured. "The engineer. What about him?" Sullivan asked. "He's not important," Edward said. "He's consistent." "That's not a compliment." "It's not meant to be." Edward tapped the paper. "He used the phrase, 'if you're sure,'" Edward said. "And so did the cafe worker. And so did Laura Mitchell's sister." Sullivan frowned. "So people say that?" "Yes," Edward said. "But they don't say it the same way." Sullivan stared at him. "You're going to tell me you can hear punctuation now?" Edward gave him a thin smile. "I can hear permission," he said. They drove in silence to a small community center tucked behind a row of shops. It had a notice board full of cheerful posters, mindfulness classes, grief support, budgeting workshops, and something called Life Reset, a practical course. Sullivan looked at the building like it might bite. "This is your lead?" he asked. "It's not my lead," Edward said. "It's theirs." He pointed at the poster. "Life Reset meets Thursday evenings," Edward said. "Where do people go when they start speaking in conclusions?" Sullivan read the poster. "Looks harmless." Edward opened the car door. "Most dangerous things do," he said. Inside, the center smelled like cheap tea and old carpet. A receptionist looked up. "Can I help you?" Sullivan flashed a badge. The woman stiffened immediately. Edward did not flash anything. He didn't need to. He smiled politely and let the silence do the work. "We're looking for Daniel Frost," Sullivan said. "Does he work here?" The receptionist glanced at Edward, then back to Sullivan. "Daniel runs sessions," she said carefully. "Is there a problem?" Edward's tone remained mild. "We're not sure yet," he said. "Could you tell us where he is?" The receptionist hesitated just long enough for Edward to hear the calculation behind her eyes. "In room 3, she said. "But he's with clients." Edward nodded. "We'll be quiet," he said, as if that was a promise. Sullivan muttered under his breath as they walked down the corridor. "This is ridiculous," he said. "We're interrogating a life coach." Edward didn't look at him. "Life coach is just a polite term for someone paid to influence decisions," he said. "So yes, Mark." "Ridiculous." Room 3 had frosted glass and a paper sign, "Private Session, Do Not Disturb." Edward stood outside the door for a moment. Sullivan shifted impatiently. "What are you doing?" Sullivan asked. "Listening," Edward said. Through the door, a man's voice, soft, controlled, was speaking in short sentences. Not motivational. Not dramatic. Just tidy. "And if you already know the end, you can stop fighting the middle," the voice said. Edward's eyes narrowed. Sullivan frowned. "That's your guy." Edward exhaled. "That's someone who knows exactly what he's doing," he said. Sullivan reached for the handle. Edward stopped him with 2 fingers on his wrist. "Don't," Edward said. Sullivan's eyes flashed. "Why not?" "Because if you barge in," Edward replied, "you turn him into a victim. And he will use that." Sullivan pulled his hand back. "What do you want?" "A polite invitation?" Edward nodded. "Yes," he said. "Actually." He knocked once. Not loud. Not timid. Precise. The voice inside stopped. A beat of silence. Then the door opened. Daniel Frost stood there like he'd been expecting them. Not today, perhaps, but eventually. He was in his mid-40s, neatly dressed, hair slightly too perfect. Not handsome in a memorable way. Handsome in a designed way. His eyes moved from Sullivan's badge to Edward's face. And lingered. "Detective Inspector Sullivan," Daniel said calmly. "I assumed it would be you." Sullivan stiffened. "You know me." Daniel smiled faintly. "You're in the local paper often enough," he said. "Not always by choice, I imagine." Then Daniel looked at Edward again. "And you must be Edward Hale." Sullivan turned sharply. "You know him too?" Daniel's smile didn't change. "I read," he said. "Some people collect stamps. I collect methods." Edward stepped forward slightly. "You've been busy," Edward said. Daniel's gaze held his. "So have you," Daniel replied. That was the first real moment of unease Edward felt, not because of the words, but because of the accuracy. Daniel gestured politely toward the room. "I'm with a client," he said. "But I can spare 5 minutes if it's urgent." "It's urgent," Sullivan said. Daniel glanced at the client behind him, an anxious-looking man in his 30s. Daniel's voice softened. "Give me a moment, Oliver," he said. "Make some tea. The kettle's there." Oliver nodded and disappeared toward a small kitchenette as if relieved to be given instructions. Edward watched him move. A man glad to be told what to do. Daniel stepped into the corridor and closed the door behind him. There was no hostility in the movement. It was simply neat. "Now," Daniel said, "how can I help the police today?" Sullivan's tone was hard. "We've had 3 deaths," he said. All preceded by the same kind of statement. Daniel nodded with polite interest. "Yes," he said. "I've read about that. It's awful." "You've read about it," Sullivan repeated. "But you already knew my name." Daniel's eyes flicked briefly to Sullivan's badge. "You have it written on your chest," Daniel said evenly. "It would be strange not to know it." Sullivan's jaw tightened. Edward spoke before Sullivan could escalate. "We heard your voice," Edward said. Daniel turned his head slightly. "On what?" "A recording," Edward replied. "You said, yes." "That sounds right." Daniel blinked once. Slowly. Not surprised, performing the appearance of thinking. "That could be anyone," he said. Edward nodded. "It could," he said. "But it wasn't." Daniel looked at him closely. "You're certain?" Daniel said. Edward held the gaze. "Yes," he replied. "Now you know how it feels." For a fraction of a second, Daniel's smile thinned. Then it returned. "Certainty is a habit," Daniel said. "Some people use it well. Some people abuse it." Edward's voice stayed calm. "And some people sell it." Daniel didn't deny it. "I help people organize their thoughts," he said. "That's all." Sullivan stepped forward. "Where were you Thursday night?" he asked. Daniel's eyes moved to Sullivan. The temperature in his gaze dropped by a degree. "I was here," he said. "Teaching a group session." "Can you prove it?" Daniel nodded. "Cameras," he said. "Sign-in sheets. Happy clients." Then he looked back at Edward. "And you?" he asked. "Why are you involved?" Edward's tone was flat. "Because someone in this city is teaching people how to stop fighting their own deaths," he said. Daniel smiled politely. "That's a dramatic way to put it," he said. "It's accurate," Edward replied. Daniel leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "Do you know what's interesting about your sentence?" Daniel asked. Edward didn't answer. Daniel continued. "You assume people want to survive," he said. But many don't. They want permission to stop trying. Edward's eyes narrowed. And you provide it? Daniel spread his hands. I provide clarity, he said. What they do with it is theirs. Sullivan's patience snapped. People are dead, he said. Don't dress it up. Daniel's voice stayed smooth. Death doesn't require my assistance, Inspector, he said. It has excellent attendance. Edward watched Daniel carefully. Not for anger. Not for fear. For pride. And there it was, faint but present, the satisfaction of being able to say outrageous things calmly. That was Daniel's magic trick. Edward stepped back. We'll be in touch, Edward said. Daniel nodded as if they'd been discussing scheduling. Of course, he said. I'm always available. Edward walked away, already thinking. Sullivan followed. When they reached the car, Sullivan exploded. That's your man, he hissed. That's it? A smug therapist with a poster. Edward didn't look at him. We can't arrest him, Edward said. Not yet. Sullivan slammed the car door. Then what? Edward's voice was quiet. Then we set a trap, he said. Edward chose the trap carefully. Not a fake confession. Not a staged witness. A person. Because this case was about a person's relationship with certainty, and nothing revealed that relationship faster than fear. He called Claire Bennett. I need a favor, he said. Claire laughed without humor. You always do. I need you to publish something, Edward said. Claire's voice sharpened. No, she said immediately. I'm not feeding this. I'm not asking you to feed it, Edward replied. I'm asking you to change it. There was a pause. How? She asked. Edward spoke evenly. Publish a correction, he said. Say the police believe the deaths are linked to a man who offers sessions about predicting end dates. Say he's been contacted. Say he's been warned. Claire exhaled. That's not a correction, she said. That's a threat in print. It's bait, Edward replied. Claire hesitated. You're weaponizing my paper, she said. Edward's tone didn't change. You already weaponized it, he replied. I'm just taking it off random mode. She was silent for a moment. Then, quietly. What happens when he reacts? She asked. Edward answered truthfully. He'll try to control the story, he said. Because that's what he sells. Claire's voice hardened. Fine, she said. But if someone dies because of it? Edward cut in. That's why I'm doing it, he said. So we can stop him before the next one does. The next step was harder. Edward needed someone Daniel Frost would want to help. Someone uncertain enough to be tempted and articulate enough to be interesting. Someone visible enough to draw Daniel out. He did not like using civilians. He hated it, in fact. But he hated the alternative more. Sullivan provided the candidate, a young officer named Rachel Moore, new to Brighton, sharp, anxious, eager to prove herself. Sullivan introduced her to Edward in a quiet corner of the station. She volunteered, Sullivan said. Rachel's jaw tightened. I didn't volunteer, she said. You told me I was ideal. Sullivan shrugged. That's a compliment. Rachel turned to Edward. So I'm bait, she said flatly. Edward didn't lie. Yes, he said. But smart bait. Rachel crossed her arms. Lovely, she said. Do I at least get hazard pay? Edward's mouth twitched. You'll get the satisfaction of being right, he said. Rachel stared at him. People like you are why therapy is popular, she muttered. Edward replied calmly. And people like him, he said, are why it's dangerous. Rachel's cover was simple. She would pose as someone spiraling after a loss, insomnia, panic, intrusive thoughts, someone who had started believing she wouldn't survive the month. She would attend Daniel's life reset session. Edward would observe from a distance. Sullivan would have men nearby. The objective was not an arrest. Not yet. The objective was to catch Daniel doing the thing he insisted he didn't do. To hear him provide permission. Because in court, intention mattered. And in this case, intention sounded like calm agreement. Thursday evening arrived with the kind of weather that made people accept bad ideas. Grey sky. Cold rain. A wind that suggested the sea was annoyed. Edward sat in a car across the street from the community center, watching through wet glass. Sullivan sat beside him, tapping the steering wheel. "You sure about this?" Sullivan asked. Edward watched the building. "No," he said. Sullivan blinked. "You're admitting uncertainty." Edward looked at him. "I'm practicing," he said. Sullivan snorted. Rachel entered the building. She did not look back. Edward admired that. Fear performed quietly was more convincing than bravery performed loudly. They waited. 10 minutes. 15. Then Daniel Frost arrived, walking like a man stepping into a room he owned emotionally, even if the deed said otherwise. He greeted the receptionist with a warm smile. Warm enough to make you trust him. Not warm enough to make you question him. Edward watched. "That's not confidence," Edward said softly. Sullivan glanced at him. "What is it?" "Control," Edward replied. After the session ended, Rachel exited first. She walked quickly, head down, hands in pockets. Edward's stomach tightened. "That's not part of the plan," Sullivan said. Edward opened the car door. "Stay," he said. Sullivan grabbed his arm. "Edward." Edward's eyes were sharp. "Stay," he repeated. "If you move, you ruin it." Then he stepped into the rain and followed Rachel at a distance. Rachel turned a corner near the pier and stopped under an awning, breathing hard. Edward approached calmly, keeping his distance. "Tell me," he said. Rachel looked at him, eyes bright with anger and something else. "He's good," she said. Edward nodded. "What did he say?" Rachel laughed once, sharply. "He didn't say you're going to die," she said. "He didn't have to." Edward's voice stayed even. "What did he say, Rachel?" Rachel swallowed. "He asked me, when I think it ends," she said. He asked it like it was normal. Like picking a train time. Edward's chest tightened. "And you answered?" Rachel's voice dropped. "I said? I don't think I'll make it past tonight," she said. "Midnight." I said midnight. Edward felt the cold deepen. "Why did you say that?" he asked. Rachel's eyes flashed. "Because he made it sound reasonable," she said. "He said if I already knew it, I could stop fighting. He said fighting was what was exhausting me." Edward exhaled slowly. "And then?" Rachel's jaw clenched. "I waited," she said. "For him to contradict me." Edward's voice was quiet. "And did he?" Rachel shook her head, staring at the ground. "No," she said. He just nodded. Edward's stomach turned. "What exactly did he say?" Rachel looked up at him, and her voice became strangely flat, mimicking the calm she'd heard. "He said?" "Yes." "That sounds right." Edward's hand tightened into a fist inside his coat pocket. There it was. Again. Clean. Polite. Deadly. Rachel's voice cracked. "And do you know the worst part?" she said. Edward looked at her. For a second, she whispered, it felt like relief. Edward nodded once. "That's the product," he said. "Relief." Rachel swallowed hard. "What do I do now?" she asked. Edward looked at his watch. 11:21 p.m. He spoke without drama. "You do exactly what we planned," he said. You don't go anywhere alone. You don't drive. You don't drink. You don't take shortcuts. Rachel stared at him. And if I still die at midnight? Edward's voice was steady. Then he wasn't guessing, he said. He was arranging. Rachel's eyes widened. You think he can make it happen? Edward looked past her toward the dark water. I think, he said, he already started. Edward walked Rachel back toward the station, keeping her talking. Talking kept the mind moving. Movement kept the mind from collapsing into a single idea. Tell me what else, he said, Edward asked. Rachel frowned. He asked about my family, she said. About my habits. My commute. Edward's tone stayed calm. Details, he said. Not feelings. Rachel nodded slowly. He asked whether I lived alone, she said. Whether I lock my door. Whether I check the stove. Edward's eyes narrowed. That's not therapy, Edward said. Rachel looked at him. What is it? Edward's voice was cold. An inventory, he said. At the station, Sullivan was waiting, face tight with anger. You put her in a room with him, Sullivan snapped at Edward. And now she thinks she's got a death appointment. Edward didn't argue. You wanted proof, Edward said. Now you have it. Sullivan pointed at Rachel. And what about her? Edward looked at Sullivan. We protect her, he said. And we watch who tries to reach her. Sullivan frowned. Reach her how? Edward's eyes were sharp. By phone, he said. By message. By a helpful visit. Sullivan's expression changed slightly. You think he'll contact her? Edward nodded. Because he can't help himself, he said. Control is a habit. At 11:38 p.m., Rachel's phone buzzed. Everyone in the room froze. Rachel stared at the screen like it was a live animal. Unknown number. Sullivan leaned over. Don't answer, he said. Edward spoke calmly. Answer, he said. Sullivan turned on him. Are you insane? Edward looked at him. If she doesn't answer, he said, we don't hear him. Rachel's hand trembled. Edward's voice softened, just slightly. Put it on speaker, he said. And breathe. Rachel hit accept. A calm male voice filled the room. Rachel, Daniel Frost said. Sullivan's eyes widened. He mouthed, how does he know? Edward didn't react. Hello, Rachel said, voice tight. Thank you for coming tonight, Daniel said. I wanted to check in. Rachel swallowed. I'm fine, she lied. Daniel's tone remained gentle. You don't sound fine, he said. You sound like someone trying to outrun a thought. Rachel glanced at Edward. Edward's gaze was steady, keep talking. I didn't sleep, Rachel said. That's all. Daniel hummed softly, as if considering a spreadsheet. And the time, he asked. Rachel's mouth went dry. What time? She forced out. The time you said, Daniel replied. Midnight. Sullivan's fist clenched. Rachel's voice shook. I don't know why I said that. Daniel's tone stayed calm. Because it was true to you, he said. You felt it. And when something feels true, resisting it is exhausting. Edward watched Rachel's face. Daniel wasn't threatening her. He was soothing her into surrender. Rachel's eyes flicked toward the clock. 11:41 p.m. Rachel, Daniel said softly, are you alone right now? Rachel hesitated. Sullivan leaned in, shaking his head. Edward's eyes narrowed. Say no, Edward said quietly to Rachel, not into the phone. Rachel swallowed. No, she said. I'm not. There was a pause. A small pause. But Edward heard it, a recalculation. Daniel's voice resumed, still smooth. "That's good," he said. "Because alone can make things louder." Edward spoke, loud enough to be heard through the speaker, calm enough to sound like he belonged. "Hello, Daniel," Edward said. Another pause. This one longer. Then Daniel spoke, still polite. "Mr. Hale," he said. "I wondered when you'd stop watching from the rain." Sullivan's eyes went to Edward, he knew. Edward's voice remained even. "You called a police officer you've met once," Edward said. "You knew her number. You knew her name. That's not counseling." Daniel's voice warmed slightly. "No," he said. "That's attention." Edward leaned closer to the phone. "You're good at making people feel noticed," Edward said. "It's a strong drug." Daniel chuckled softly. "And you," he replied, "are good at making people feel dissected." Edward didn't deny it. "What do you want?" Edward asked. Daniel's tone was gentle, almost sincere. "I want you to stop turning this into theater," he said. "People don't need your suspicion. They need peace." Edward's eyes stayed on the clock. 11:44 p.m. "Peace," Edward repeated. "Yes," Daniel said. "Some people are exhausted. They want the fight to end." Edward's voice sharpened by a degree. "So you end it for them?" Daniel's tone did not change. "I don't end anything," he said. "I just stop lying to them." Edward's jaw tightened. "Do you tell them the truth?" Edward asked. "Or do you tell them something that feels tidy?" Daniel's voice was almost kind. "What's the difference?" he asked. Edward answered immediately. "The difference," he said, "is whether they had a chance." Silence. Then Daniel spoke, quieter now. "You can't save everyone," he said. Edward's voice went cold. "No," he said. "But I can stop you." Daniel's tone was pleasant again, as if the conversation had become mildly boring. "Midnight is close," Daniel said. "You should focus on her breathing." Edward's eyes flicked to the clock. 11:45 p.m. Edward spoke to Rachel, steady and direct. "Rachel," he said, "look at me." Rachel did. Her face was pale. "Name 5 things you can see," Edward said. "What?" she whispered. "Now," Edward said. Rachel blinked rapidly. "Your coat," she said. "The clock." Sullivan's badge. "The lamp." "The water stain on the ceiling." "Good," Edward said. "For things you can feel." Rachel swallowed. "The chair," she said. "My hands." "My boots." "The air." 3 things you can hear." Rachel listened, breathing shakily. "The buzzing light," she said. "Traffic outside." His voice. Edward nodded. 2 things you can smell." Rachel's lips trembled. "Coffee," she said. "Rain." "Your coat smells like rain." Edward's voice remained calm. 1 thing you can taste." Rachel swallowed. "Metal," she said quietly. Edward nodded once. Daniel's voice came softly through the speaker. "That won't change the time," Daniel said. Edward leaned toward the phone. "It changes the person," he replied. At 11:58 p.m., a uniformed officer rushed into the room. "Inspector," he said urgently. "A car hit a barrier outside. Someone tried to force their way through. They were looking for Officer Moore." Sullivan's face hardened. "Who?" he snapped. "They won't give a name," the officer said. "But they said they are a friend from the center." Edward's eyes narrowed. Daniel didn't need to make midnight lethal by magic. He just needed to direct someone, an anxious admirer, a believer, a helper, into motion. Certainty, outsourced. Sullivan grabbed his radio. Edward stayed with Rachel. The phone line was still open. Daniel was still there, listening. Daniel, Edward said quietly, you didn't just predict. You deployed. Daniel's voice was calm. I didn't send anyone, he said. People choose to help. Edward nodded slightly. And you choose who they want to help, he said. Rachel's breathing quickened. Edward looked at her. Keep your eyes on me, he said. Not the clock. Rachel's lips moved, as if praying. 11:59 p.m. The room felt smaller. Daniel's voice came softly, almost like a lullaby. Midnight, he said. Edward spoke into the phone with a precision that cut through the air. No, he said. Not for her. Silence. Then Daniel's voice, still polite. You're very confident, he said. Edward's gaze was steady. I'm borrowing your product, he replied. The clock clicked over. 12 a.m. Nothing happened. No collapse. No scream. No sudden end. Rachel blinked, confused, still alive. Her breath caught. Then, slowly, she exhaled. Edward watched her shoulders drop slightly, as if a weight had been removed. Daniel's voice came after a pause. Interesting, he said quietly. Edward leaned toward the speaker. Tell me something, Daniel, he said. When your prediction fails, does it annoy you? Daniel's voice remained controlled, but Edward heard the smallest crack, a fraction of irritation. It doesn't fail, Daniel said. It adjusts. Edward smiled faintly. And that, he said, is why you're going to lose. The arrest didn't happen that night. Not in the clean way stories like to pretend. Because Daniel Frost had not stabbed anyone. Had not poisoned anyone. Had not pushed anyone off a ledge. He had done something harder to prosecute. He had persuaded people into their own exits. But persuasion leaves traces if you know where to look. Over the next 48 hours, Edward and Sullivan did what Daniel never expected. They treated words like evidence. They found Rachel's sign-in sheet, her name already written in Daniel's tidy handwriting. They found the call logs, numbers linked through client coordination. They found that helper who drove to the station, a man who believed he was saving Rachel from panic by getting her alone. The man admitted Daniel had told him, calmly, that Rachel needed a quiet place to accept what was coming. And in Daniel's notes, because Daniel kept notes, of course, Edward found the real crime. Not predictions. Instructions. How to isolate. How to time. How to encourage acceptance without ever using the word death. Edward sat across from Daniel in an interview room that smelled of disinfectant and burnt coffee and mild panic. Daniel looked as composed as ever. You're making this very complicated, Daniel said. Edward's tone was flat. You made it complicated, he replied. I'm just translating. Daniel smiled faintly. For someone who hates mysticism, he said, you've built quite a ritual around me. Edward looked at him, eyes steady. I don't hate mysticism, he said. I hate lazy explanations. Daniel's gaze sharpened slightly. And what's your explanation for me? He asked. Edward didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He simply said the truth. You sell certainty, he said. And you sell it to people who are too tired to argue. Daniel's smile thinned. And you, Daniel said, sell doubt. You sell it like a scalpel. People bleed either way. Edward nodded once. Yes, he said. The difference is I don't pretend it's kindness. Daniel leaned back. I never killed anyone, he said quietly. Edward leaned forward. No, he replied. You just convinced them not to survive. Daniel's eyes held his. For a moment, the room went very still. Then Daniel's voice returned to polite calm. Prove it, he said. Edward nodded. We will, he said. Not with blood. With language. Daniel's smile returned, faint and controlled. Language is slippery, he said. Edward's gaze didn't move. So are you, he replied. That's why we're using paper. Epilogue. After the time passed, Daniel Frost was not arrested for murder. That fact irritated Mark Sullivan more than he cared to admit. He stood in his office, staring at the city through a rain-streaked window, reading the same paragraph for the fourth time. Charges pending: coercive control, reckless endangerment, unlawful practice of psychological counseling, conspiracy to cause harm. No murder. No neat ending. Edward Hale sat opposite him, coat still on, as if he might leave at any moment. You look disappointed, Edward said. Sullivan scoffed. I look realistic, he replied. People died. He'll argue philosophy in court. Edward nodded. He was always going to, he said. That's the product. Sullivan turned. Product, he repeated. You keep calling it that. That's what it is, Edward said calmly. He didn't sell death. He sold relief from uncertainty. Sullivan rubbed his face. And people bought it. Yes, Edward said. Because it was cheaper than hope. Rachel Moore took 3 weeks off. Not because she was injured. Because she had learned something about her own mind that required distance. Edward met her once before she left town, in a quiet cafe far from the pier. She looked better. Not healed. Just present. I keep thinking about that moment, she said, stirring her coffee. When nothing happened. Edward nodded. That's normal. I was so sure, she said. For a few minutes, I was absolutely sure. Edward watched her carefully. Certainty feels like clarity, he said. But it's usually just exhaustion wearing confidence. Rachel smiled faintly. He never told me to die, she said. No, Edward replied. He let you finish the sentence yourself. Rachel looked at him. Is that what you do? She asked. Edward did not answer immediately. When I'm careful, he said, I do the opposite. Rachel considered that. And when you're not? Edward met her gaze. Then I remind myself why I stopped working for the police, he said. She nodded, accepting that was all she would get. Before she left, she paused. You saved me, she said. Edward shook his head. No, he replied. You stayed. She smiled once, then walked out into the daylight. The city quieted down after that. Not because it understood what had happened. Because the story had lost its sharp edge. Claire Bennett published a final piece, shorter, restrained, almost apologetic. The Myth of the Man Who Knew. Edward read it once, then put it away. Claire met him later that week, uncharacteristically subdued. I didn't mean to make it worse, she said. I know, Edward replied. You meant to make it interesting. She winced. Same thing, she said. Edward sipped his drink. Not always, he said. But often enough to be dangerous. Claire watched him for a moment. You ever worry, she asked, that you do the same thing? Edward raised an eyebrow. By telling people not to believe. By telling them how, she said. Edward considered that. Yes, he said. That's why I don't write headlines. Daniel Frost was remanded pending trial. Edward visited him once. Only once. The interview room was the same as always, too bright, too clean, pretending neutrality. Daniel looked thinner. Not broken. Just adjusted. You didn't come to gloat, Daniel said mildly. No, Edward replied. I came to close a loop. Daniel smiled faintly. You always did like symmetry. Edward sat down. Do you still believe you didn't kill anyone? Edward asked. Daniel did not hesitate. Yes, he said. People made choices. Edward nodded. So did you, he said. Daniel leaned back. I gave them certainty, he said. You give them doubt. Which one do you think hurts more? Edward's voice was steady. Doubt keeps the future open, he said. Certainty shuts it. Daniel studied him. You're afraid of how similar we are, Daniel said. Edward didn't deny it. I'm afraid of how easy it is, he replied. Daniel's smile thinned. You'll do this again, Daniel said. Someone else will. Because people hate waiting. Edward stood. Then someone else will stop them, he said. Daniel tilted his head. And who stops you? Edward paused at the door. I do, he said. Every day. Weeks passed. Life resumed its careless pace. Edward returned to his work, small cases, quiet consultations, problems without headlines. One evening, he sat alone in his flat, listening to the city breathe. A radio murmured in the background. A neighbor laughed. Somewhere, a kettle boiled. Ordinary sounds. Uncertain sounds. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Edward stared at it for a moment. Then he answered. Yes, he said. A man's voice, nervous but trying not to be. Sorry, the man said. Wrong number. Edward smiled faintly. It happens, he said. The line disconnected. Edward set the phone down. He did not feel relief. He felt something better. Space. Later that night, Edward stopped at a small shop near his building. The cashier, a young man with tired eyes, rang up the total. Rough week, the cashier said casually. Feels like everything's coming to an end these days. Edward waited. The cashier laughed awkwardly. I probably won't live to see Christmas, he added, joking. Edward looked at him. Not sharply. Not urgently. Just attentively. The cashier shifted. Sorry, he said. Bad joke. Edward shook his head. Not bad, he said. Just unfinished. The cashier frowned. What do you mean? Edward paid and picked up his bag. I mean, he said calmly, Christmas is a long way off. A lot can happen before then. The cashier considered that. Yeah, he said slowly. I suppose it is. Edward nodded. Good night, he said. He stepped back into the rain. Outside, the city stretched forward into a future no one had named yet. Edward Hale walked home without checking the time. For now, that was enough. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more psychological mysteries where nothing supernatural is happening, and that's what makes it disturbing. New detective stories are released regularly. Until next time, pay attention to the words people choose.